Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the City of Piedmont's Police Call Data Analysis Community Meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to describe and take questions on the upcoming analysis of police call data, which was approved by the City Council at an open public meeting on July 19th. I'm Assistant City Administrator, City Clerk John Tulloch, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's meeting. The meeting will begin with opening remarks from City Administrator Sara Lillevand and Police Chief Jeremy Bowers. Then Professors Michael Smith and Robert Tilyer from the University of Texas, San Antonio will give a presentation describing how their research will be undertaken. Once the presentation is over, questions from the community will be answered. Because of the large amount of interest in this issue, we're asking community members to submit questions in writing via the Q&A feature of Zoom. Click on the Q&A icon in Zoom and type your questions in. If you'd like to ask anonymously, click the check mark next to Send Anonymously before you send your message. I will review the questions that are submitted, group similar topics together, and then pose them to the panel. We can't promise we'll get to every question that's been asked, but we'll do our best to do so in the time allotted. And with that, I'd like to invite City Administrator Sara Lillevand to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, John, and good evening, all. Thank you for tuning in to this important conversation. Some of the most meaningful work we are engaged in as a city is an examination of what we do and how we do it with an anti-bias and an anti-racist lens. Policing in particular has appropriately been in the national, regional, and local spotlight in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. This research project we'll be discussing tonight is aimed at really a data-driven approach to understanding our calls for service and who and how we currently respond to those calls, such that we can understand how our current staffing model lines up with the needs of our community. This information will be critical for future decisions about staffing and responding most appropriately in Piedmont. In addition, this project will dig into understanding potential bias-based calls that come into our dispatch center, those that are tied to someone's appearance, perhaps, rather than any specific behavior. We'll hear a lot more detail about this project from our researchers and from our chief. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce Piedmont Police Chief Jeremy Bowers, who spearheaded this project and who has been proactively leading a department committed to transparency and best practices for the past 5 years. Chief Bowers.
Thank you, City Administrator Lillevand. I appreciate that. Good evening to everybody. So as City Administrator mentioned, over the course of the last year, and really, even beyond that, the profession of policing has been front and center as a topic nationally, as well as locally. We at the Piedmont Police Department have not only been responsive to these conversations, but have a track record of being proactive in ensuring we bring the right people into the organization. We provide them with the most up-to-date training. We hold ourselves accountable while building community connections and engaging with that community. Tonight is a natural extension of that work. It's healthy for any organization to assess how it is delivering the essential services of responding to those who use its services. My goal with this call data project is to obtain facts and data to help in our ongoing community conversations about policing locally. Key in this process is the community's ability to walk with us on this path. And this is really the first step in that journey tonight. I'm happy to introduce Professors Michael Smith and Rob Tilyer of the University of Texas at San Antonio. The UTSA criminology and criminal justice faculty are nationally recognized for their scholarship and are committed to innovative research. With expertise in a variety of areas, UTSA brings substantial quantitative and qualitative methodologies, criminological and criminal justice system theories, and substantive expertise in policing, courts, and corrections. Professor Smith is a nationally recognized expert on racial profiling, and his other areas of focus include racial ethnic disparities in policing, police use of force, and police law and public policy. In addition to his responsibilities as Associate Dean for Graduate Student Success at UTSA, Professor Tilyer's research has focused on criminal justice system decision-making, victimization, crime prevention, and criminal events. Before I conclude and hand things off to the professors, I just want to thank those of you who tuned in tonight and who will make the time to watch this event as it's being recorded. Public safety is all of our responsibility. And I truly appreciate your partnership in helping us continue to ensure that the public safety we create is just and predicated on best practices. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Smith. I believe he's going to kick us off, and then we'll, from what I understand, we'll hear from Professor Tilyer. Thank you.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Chief. And it's good to be with all of you in Piedmont this evening. Your weather is certainly a bit nicer than we have in Texas at the moment, so we're happy to be here in many ways. We're happy, especially to be engaged in this project and for the city to reaching out to us and seeking our assistance with what we think is going to be we hope is going to be an interesting and helpful project. And one that as professors who study these issues are, sort of inherently interesting to us, and which, as Chief Bowers indicated, we've had quite a bit of experience working on with a number of agencies for quite a while. In my case, for more than 25 years, including some work that we've done locally here in the Bay Area, in San Jose, as part of a collaborative reform team that examined the work and the practices of the San Francisco Police Department, and now here in Piedmont as well. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, let him introduce himself for just a couple minutes, and then we have a PowerPoint that we'll share with you momentarily on the screen and walk you through what our intended plan is in our engagement with the city. So, Rob?
Yeah, great, thanks. And as Mike suggested and stated, it's a pleasure to be here, and we're very excited about working on this project. These are the types of research engagement and sort of grassroots community engaged projects that are exciting, and so we're ready to get rolling. We've been here all day and met with the PD and sort of further scoped out what we're going to do, and excited to share it with you this evening. So that's it from me. Mike, I think, is going to start us off with a presentation, and you'll hear from me in a little bit. So share this, and that's what I want.
Slideshow.
Where am I seeing? Oh,
there we go.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Hopefully you all can see that. So again, welcome, or we're happy to be here, and we've been made very welcome, and we are anxious to get started with the project, which really sort of began sorry about that. There we go. Thank you. Some months ago, with some discussions that we began first with Chief Bowers, who approached us about the possibility of doing what ultimately came to be this project, and we're at the point now where, excuse me, in July we signed a contract with the University of Texas at San Antonio, signed a contract with the City of Piedmont to engage us in this particular project, and we are, to this trip and this visit is really the beginning of this partnership. We will at the end of the presentation kind of lay out the timeline for you, but this is a little bit about the background and kind of how we came to be here and be involved with your particular city. And as we've indicated, this is the kind of work that we do frequently with agencies around the country, and so this was sort of in our wheelhouse. So we have a scope of work that we've agreed upon with the city here that's going to guide the work that we do. And we have kind of two main areas that we will focus on. The first is this analysis that's on your screen here, the description of this analysis of calls for service made to the Piedmont Police Department. And so, a key question that a lot of communities are asking themselves is whether there are alternatives to police response for certain kinds of calls or certain call types. I said this is a national conversation that's going on in a lot of cities, including our home city in San Antonio, where we recently concluded a fairly similar kind of project with the San Antonio Police Department, helping it and the city of San Antonio think about its calls for service and whether or not there's a potential categories or types of calls that might be amenable for some non-police response, or at least for a co-response between the police and some other entity. So in big picture sense, that's what we will be doing in phase one of this particular project. So we'll be looking at your call types, the police resources that you utilize in responding to those calls, how those calls change throughout the life of the call, if you will. And that's a fairly frequent occurrence. What the call comes in as oftentimes is different than what the call is closed out as or is disposed of as. And that sometimes can matter in terms of helping the city and the police and its police department think through from an informed evidence-based standpoint what types of calls might potentially be again amenable to some response other than the police or in addition to the police. Thank you. There we go. The second component of our study is related in the sense that it's calls for service driven, but the research question is different here. What we're interested in helping the city understand is the impact of calls for service that come into the police department, how those drive its responses, and whether or not there are potential racial or ethnic disparities in those calls, and then how those may link to police response. So we will use the calls for service data that we're going to obtain from the city for both components of the study. But in this second aspect, we will also make use of a number of other sources of data that the city possesses. So for example, we're interested in understanding who are the suspected, the racial and ethnic descriptions of those who are reported as crime suspects in official police reports. So when someone calls the police to report that they've been victimized, they have a description of the suspect. Then we will obtain those data over the course of about a 5-year period, is a 5-year look back period, is sort of from July of this year, looking back 5 years, is sort of the scope of the data analysis that we will use for both aspects of the project. We'll also look at the racial and ethnic composition of the arrestees here in Piedmont, as well as those who may be contacted by the police in the field in some manner that falls short of an arrest, but for which we may have descriptions of the persons whom the police stopped and questioned. So those two aspects of the project together make up why we've been engaged, and to sort of round out both aspects of those, we will come back to Piedmont sometime in late September, most likely, to conduct some community focus groups to help identify and illuminate both aspects of the project, and we will rely on the city and Chief Bowers to pull those focus groups together to provide us a representation of the community perspectives here in Piedmont. At the end of all of this, we will prepare a detailed report that outlines our findings, our data analysis findings, the qualitative review that we will do of the focus group data that we conduct or that we gather, and then we will report out again in a detailed report to the city. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who'll talk a little bit about some of the prior research that's been done in these areas that touch upon the kind of work that we'll be doing here. And then I'll come back and lay out the timeline for you.
Great, thanks, Mike. So, I think one of the things that's important to point out is that, our approach to these types of research projects and our engagement, certainly with your community, is evidence-based, right? So we're interested in helping the city and the police department understand, what sort of actions are occurring by looking at data. And part of that is driven by understanding what's going on around the country and what other departments are doing, what other researchers have found, and what best practices kind of are in this particular context. So I just want to highlight a couple of studies that are all recent, very current within the last year or so, that sort of speak to and give us some guidance on how we're going to approach our particular work here, because we think that it's demonstrated effectiveness for other jurisdictions and other agencies. So Mike mentioned a minute ago the project that him and I worked on in San Antonio. So I'm just going to start there because I think it's informative to give a sense of sort of the approach that was taken and how that might apply here. So so we were engaged with the city of San Antonio and its police department in a similar scope, right? To examine their calls for service, to understand what the demands are of their police agency by the community. And so this kind of gives you an outline of what we did there. We looked at roughly about 3 million calls for service to the police over just slightly under 3-year period. And what we decided and what made sense and has also been used by other researchers, which I'll speak to in a moment, is looking at not only what type of calls were coming in, how they were categorized in terms of their seriousness or their priority, but then also importantly, what sort of police resources were applied and required to respond to those requests for service. So we looked at things like, for example, the number of units that needed to be dispatched, the amount of time that it took for officers to respond, the amount of time, importantly, that it spent on the scene, to get a sense of what the demands were on the police agency, and then obviously what the end disposition is, or the resolution of the call. And while there were 3 million calls over this, roughly a little under 3-year period, we focused specifically on lower priority calls. So those that were not that as serious as, for example, a robbery in progress or something that required a high priority response, right? We're focused on lower priority calls that might be amenable potentially to some alternative response, some sort of co-response, or potentially stay with the police because that makes the most sense from an empirical standpoint and then a policy perspective. And so we looked at those in particular, and I think what the analysis showed us and what we produced in our final report for the city was that there were some calls, some call types, some types of problems, if you will, that the citizens were calling about, that maybe didn't always result in a criminal offense or some criminal reporting or further investigation by the police, but still required police resources to respond to. Things like panhandling, some particular types of disturbances, lost property, and a bunch of other similar type of actions. And so we did this analysis, presented this to the city, to the policymakers, to ultimately allow them sort of an informed perspective on how they wanted to proceed in their jurisdiction, in their community. A separate study done by a different researcher in Philadelphia looked at particular focus here in Philadelphia on health-related or mental health-related calls for service. And so similarly to the sort of approach that we took in San Antonio, his approach looked at about 1 million calls over about a 1-year period. Philadelphia and San Antonio are actually relatively evenly sized cities in the big scope of things. So it's not surprising you saw sort of similar demands on police resources in those larger places. He took all those call types again that came in and categorized them into a variety of different sort of buckets: community, crime, medical, public health. And he basically calculated how much time and energy did the police have to expend to respond to those calls. I think a couple of findings are particularly important to note, and they're pointed out there in the key findings points. Crime calls, obviously, and this shouldn't be surprising probably, took up a large majority of the time in responding to calls for service, right? More serious, they take more time, investigation to respond to. But because of the focus was on public health in particular, what was interesting is that about 80% of the public health related calls that were received by the Philadelphia Police Department sort of stayed in that category. After a police officer responded, it was sort of resolved, or the disposition was in a similar sense, that there was some sort of medical or mental health situation. But interestingly, a number of those calls that appeared as mental health calls actually resulted in some other crime identification or some other police activity or outcome, further investigation, some cases arrest. And so what that demonstrates, right, is sort of what Mike referenced earlier, that sometimes these calls come in a certain sort of category, you look at them, but as you investigate them slightly, right, they may end up looking and requiring a different response. And so his conclusion, I've sort of reproduced here, is that basically we shouldn't assume just because of a certain type of call comes in that that's necessarily where it's going to end up, and that oftentimes an officer is necessary on the scene to help make that determination. So that's sort of the takeaway from his experience in Philadelphia. And the last one, and there won't be any quizzes on this, even though we are university professors, there'll be no quizzes later on this material, but the last one is actually a pretty impressive study, and I think really important. And these researchers looked at 9 different agencies. So they had a wide range of data from a variety of different places around the country. Very similar sort of approach, right? Categorization of calls into different groups, looked at how much police resources were expended, looked at how calls were disposed of, whether a report was written or not, whether an arrest or a citation was issued. And the key findings here, I think, are particularly important to keep in mind as we embark on this study, right? So first of all, there's a lot of calls for service to the police. Again, these are larger agencies, but that principle, I think, applies to smaller jurisdictions like yourself. There is demand on the police for a response from the community. Mental health calls are important and critical to have a response, but are much less frequent than I think sometimes the sort of common discussion is, and the expectation is sort of in the broader conversation around police community relations right now. They certainly exist, they are important, but they're not as frequent as we sometimes might assume them to be, which is another reason why it's helpful and important to look at some empirical data to actually inform us and make sure we're working with facts about what's happening. A number of calls that fall into categories that we might think could be transferred to another agency, their assessment is that may present other challenges that we don't initially recognize, right? If you're going to offload calls or move calls to some other agency, that's going to require that other agency to have resources, to have the capacity, to have the legitimacy to be able to respond to it in an effective manner. And then certainly not last but not least is the idea of safety, right? Officers are well trained. They're put in a situation where their public safety is a prime key ingredient to what they do, and they're trained for that. And so we have to keep safety certainly in mind. And so their conclusions, based on looking at the data that they did, is that it's important to look at the effectiveness of the police response, and certainly I think that's what the chief and the city administrator here, are interested in as well. But also, a broader question of, is there a way that the demand on police resources can be reduced, right? Is there a way to lower the reliance on police response in some situations? And that's an open question, certainly. So that just gives you a little bit of the landscape of kind of where the research is currently at, where the conversations are at in other jurisdictions. And it's certainly going to help direct sort of how we're approaching the methodology that Mike laid out for you here in this community. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Rob. This slide gives you an idea of what our timeline, our agreed upon timeline with the city looks like. So we're here in August. We're engaging in that first bullet point right now. We're briefing the community and internal stakeholders to the city on what we plan to do, what our methodology is, what our agreed upon research questions and goals are. We had a very lengthy, very productive, I should say, meeting today with city data folks about what kind of data the city has that could help inform these questions, data that are captured in the CAD system, the 911 or call system that's used by dispatchers to dispatch officers, as well as other data systems that the city maintains to take police reports, field interviews, that kind of thing. So we had these meetings to discuss what the sort of the scope of the data, what they look like, and how we can best get those transferred to us for subsequent analysis. So that's happening right now. I mentioned that we will likely be back here in late September to conduct some community focus groups to help inform our 2 research questions. We'll be in the meantime continuing to work with the police agency and city IT folks to get those data transferred to us. In the latter part of the fall, October to December, that's when we will be doing the bulk of our work, analyzing the data, preparing the various graphs and charts that you'll see in the final report that we'll prepare and deliver to the city as a draft in the early part of 2022, in January timeframe of 2022. We'll give the city and its stakeholders some time to review that report, to provide us any feedback or comments that are appropriate. And then we will finalize the report and deliver the final draft to the city sometime in February. And then we will come back and we will conduct similar kind of engagement with stakeholders, including community stakeholders, to report out on our findings and any recommendations that might be included in the report. So that's gives you a sense. There's actually a lot to do between now and February, and so we're here and eager to get started. So at that with that, we will we'll sort of be quiet and allow some folks to ask us questions, and we'll have those in the chat, and we'll respond to them as they come in.
All right, thank you. Just as a reminder for those who joined us after the start, because of the large amount of interest in this issue, we're asking community members to submit their questions in writing via the Q&A feature in Zoom. Click on the Q&A icon in Zoom and type your questions in. If you'd like to ask anonymously, click the check mark next to send anonymously before submitting your comment, your question. So the first question that's here is about the analysis. It says, for the call of service analysis, can you explain how the data will be used to recommend a different response? For example, will you correlate call type with crime rate to determine whether community calls are impacting responses to crimes?
So I'll take a shot at that and let my colleague jump in as well. So thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. The type of analysis that we will do with your calls for service data is similar to what was laid out in those slides that Rob went through. So key questions here are, what are the types of calls, the different types of calls that come into the police agency? How are those categorized as high, medium, or low priority calls, for example? The kind of resources that are needed to respond to them. How many officers have to be dispatched? How long do they stay on the scene, for example? What are the typical outcomes or dispositions of those calls? And do they change? and if so, how, between what they came in as, what they were received as, versus what they were ultimately cleared as. Those are all important pieces of information that we will pull together from the analysis that we do that will help your city leaders, the police chief, city administrator, make decisions about the appropriateness of the police responding to certain types of calls versus perhaps other agencies. Help them assess that. There is not necessarily any right or wrong answer to that question, and our report won't make prescriptive recommendations to the city that you should respond to these and not these kinds of calls. That's really a policy question that each city has to address and wrestle with, given its own resources and resource constraints. So what we hope to do is that our analysis and the data that we provide will help inform those policy decisions that will be made by the city.
Yeah, I mean, that largely covers it. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's the appropriate role for us as objective analysts, right? Is to provide the city with the necessary facts and empirical evidence to make an informed decision of how to proceed from here. And so that's what we see as our role, and that's certainly how we're going to proceed from here.
All right, we have another question about sort of the research methodology and how you'll take certain things into account. The question is, how will you determine if the call without a specific description of crime-related behavior involves race or ethnic-based description? For example, will coded language like, "it looks like he doesn't belong here," or something along those lines be considered a race-based call?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We talked a bit today in our data meeting about how its call takers capture information from callers as it relates to suspect descriptions. And so we will be looking closely at those data and attempting to make sense of them in ways that will inform the question about how suspects are described by callers and how those descriptions align with other indicators that we can make use of. Who's arrested, who are reported criminal suspects in Piedmont, who the police contact in the field, those kinds of things. So at this point, I probably don't want to commit one way or the other to how we might handle sort of vague descriptions like this, person doesn't belong, that kind of thing. Those decisions will sort of be informed by the data that we see and our experience, and we will take them into account in the analysis that we produce.
Great, thank you very much. Another question about what the research will consider. Will it consider both calls for service from the public and officer-initiated engagements?
Yeah, so thank you again. Good question. We talked about that as well today. I think there's interest. Typically, these kinds of call studies focus primarily on community-driven calls to the police. But in your particular case, I think there's some interest in a sub-analysis of actually officer-generated activity as that generates CAD entries or calls, and what we might glean from looking at that as a subset. So I think that's what we discussed today, and I think that's what we will do. Rob?
Yeah, I would just quickly add, I mean, it's a very astute question, because if you think about the nature of the source of the record or the call, there's a substantive difference between a citizen calling, asking for resources, a response or support or, for information, versus an officer taking an action of their own volition, right? And so that's a very important distinction. And I think that, we're certainly aware of that and recognize the need to disentangle those at minimum, because they're not the same sort of variety of call for service.
Thank you very much. Another call kind of about the data you're going to use. Will the last year 2020 call data be used for analysis? And if so, do you think it's going to be skewed by COVID and the shelter in place orders?
So the answer is yes, it will be used. We'll start with July 1st of this year, and we will work backward 5 years. So we'll have a pretty good retrospective of what your calls look like over that 5-year period, including how they may have differed in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. So those data will be available to us, and we will be able to account for them in the analyses that we do.
Great, thank you. A question about the data from the city's automated license plate reader system. Will the analysis include ALPR data as a factor in crime response? Does responding to an ALPR affect other responses or patrol? How's that data going to be worked out?
Yeah, and part of that, I think, the chief might want to respond to as well, but I'll certainly just say that, we talked about this as well today in our data meeting. And again, the recognition that particular data source is different from a call from a citizen, is different from an officer initiated call. And so we certainly plan to, again, sort of look at those separately, or at least understand that those are not the same type of reason for the response. And I'll let, I don't know if the chief wants to add on in terms of its impact on other crime response.
Yeah, and from my perspective, when we talked about specifically how our department utilizes the ALPR cameras, not just from a investigatory perspective, so post-act, but to proximately affect crime. And that means that our staff receives alerts in the present and can respond to locate, the wanted vehicle where one of a few things happens. The person takes off, or the person's pulled over and taken into custody for the alleged crime. But in that respect, not so much from the investigatory perspective, but certainly from the proximate crime impact perspective, I think we do want to use Professor Tilyer's term, disentangle sort of that aspect from the other two, because it is distinct.
Another question about the data. Will the call data to be analyzed include calls that come in from the school district to the police department?
Yeah, another good question. And again, another one that we discussed in our meeting today. So the short answer is yes. In fact, we discussed ways in which to accurately identify calls that are related to schools. And we understand the interest in that subset of calls, in particular here in Piedmont. So yes, we will that'll be a part of the analysis that we engage in.
Great, thank you. Another call sort of related to the school district, but it says this may be outside of the scope, but it will, is there a possibility of seeing the frequency and type of calls related to the schools?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
I think again, the short answer is yes. I mean, I think that's certainly going to be a possibility. And I think that if there's interest in that, it's not difficult to isolate that particular source and take a look at and see what types of calls those are. That's certainly possible.
I'm going to turn to a couple of questions now that have come in about the focus groups. The first is, what do you hope to learn from the focus group responses, and how will that affect your data analysis?
Right. So thank you for the question. As Rob and I are both quantitative criminologists who are used to working with data and have for many years. data sets large and small, and we hold great value in that, and think that there's most decisions are better when they're evidence informed and data informed. But information and data come in more than one flavor, and in much of the work of this kind, in particular, that I have done in other communities, I've actually found qualitative data, focus groups, interviews, ride-alongs in some cases, depending on what the research question is, to be of tremendous value in helping inform the understanding of the quantitative analyses. And so this mixed method approach is our preferred method, and one that we'll bring to bear here in Piedmont. So I anticipate that we'll use the qualitative data that we generate from the focus groups just in that fashion to help us better understand the numbers, right? The frequencies and the percentages and the changes that we see, and those kinds of things. The focus group data typically is very informative to the whole project, to the understanding of the whole project, which then will help inform our description of it in our report to the community.
And yeah, I mean, that's 100% accurate. I would also add, I think it's really critical because that sort of, drawing from two different places, both the police data and the community, sort of is emblematic of police community relations and good relationships between a partnership between police agencies and their community, right? We need to understand what the police are doing. We need to hear from the community to understand what the demands are, what the requests are of the police. And so in some ways, without sort of both sides of that coin, you're limiting a little bit your ability to comprehensively describe and empirically understand the nature of the situation. And so it's critically important to have that context for what we see in the official data.
And then we'll turn to another question about the focus groups. And it's, what's the recruiting criteria for the focus group participants? Are you looking to talk to a representative sampling of residents, community members who may have been the victims of bias, members of diversity interest groups, or something else? What are those criteria?
So thank you again for the question, and the answer is yes to all of those. Again, we spoke about this this afternoon in a meeting we had with City Administrator and Chief Bowers about the need to get a broad sampling of individuals from the community who represent various constituencies in the community, and some of the ones that are reflected in that question are important ones. And we Rob and I won't be directly involved in selecting the participants. That will be, we will conduct focus groups with the participants that are chosen by the city. But certainly those kinds of constituencies, I think, would be well received by us and important for voices for us to hear from.
Yeah, and if I may add a little bit to that as well, just to add on to Professor Smith's comments, the only thing I would say is that that's certainly all those things will be considered by the city administrator and I, and then in addition to that, just to kind of call out the fact that we have a decent starting point as well, not an end point, but a starting point in terms of the folks we engaged with our relatively recent strategic plan focus groups that we held. So a number of stakeholders we reached out to, because we exactly did the point of that question. We wanted a broad base of folks with different perspectives to participate and provide their perspectives. And so that's certainly what we're going to be going after again. And that provided a good starting point in looking at that. So it's not fully baked yet in terms of how exactly we're going to do that, but certainly will help inform our future discussions and decisions.
Chief, since you're on the microphone here, there's a question about staffing, about how the department staffs Is there a community service officer on duty all the time? You know, someone who can handle non-crime related calls?
Yes, appreciate the staffing question. So our current CSOs and for the group, that's a community service officer, which is a position we just established about a year and a half ago or so. And we evolved the position of parking enforcement officer to a community service officer, identifying that there was opportunities there to have those folks do an expanded assortment of tasks. So currently, those positions are part-time positions. They are not a full-time position. So to answer the question directly, our CSOs, our community service officers, are not on duty 24/7 to respond to some of the lower level things. But again, to the point that the city administrator made on the outset of this, that's why, in part, why we're doing this work to look at the type of calls we're getting, the frequency, and looking at to make some decisions with respect to how we're staffed, and comparing that to the to the requests that we're getting and the calls for service that we're getting, to make sure that we're staffed appropriately.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to turn to questions now about the report. The first one is, how much of the report is going to be made available to the public?
Well, ultimately, that's a decision for the city. Our report, there will be nothing classified or secret in our report, and our reports typically are made public. So from our perspective, it will be public. We would have no problem with it being public.
I'll just jump in to confirm that the intention is for this all to be public and presented to the public. That's why we're doing it.
And along those lines, there was a question regarding whether de-identified or aggregate call data used in the analysis would be made available with the report.
Again, that's probably a question best answered by the city, to the extent to which it wants to make the actual data themselves available. I'm not sure. I'll turn that over to someone from the city to answer.
Yeah. So from my perspective, again, that's something that we can discuss. I think at the end of the day, what we're really interested in doing is looking at the overall broad picture of the data. That we're receiving from the analysis from the professors here tonight, not so much each, the aggregate. So, I mean, I think from my perspective as well, it's ensuring that, again, in terms of not wanting to ensure that, we're really focusing on the larger issues, that the data, to answer the research questions, quite frankly, the extent to which we're answering those questions is going to kind of guide my perspective in terms of what we're going to be putting out there. Obviously, the report is going to be made public, but I'm interested in focusing on the research questions, answering that scope, and to the extent that some other pieces of information can help us along that way, and we can be transparent with our community. That's certainly open to conversation.
And then this is the last question I have in queue, but and directed towards the chief and the city administrator. How is the city planning on engaging the community about the results that are received?
You want to start with that, chief, and then I'll add if
Sure.
needed.
Absolutely. So I'll start by just echoing the timeline and recounting what Professor Smith was talking about in terms of coming back out. Obviously, the engagement piece, we're going to have the focus groups, and then they're going to go do their research. Then we're going to come back to the community for an opportunity to look at the final report and have a presentation on the final report as well. But just understand, in terms of this research project and in the larger topics and conversations, that are going on with it. That's just the beginning. This is just to get data and information for our continued conversations that we as a community are going to have with respect to policing, how we're policing, what resources we're utilizing for public safety here in Piedmont. Again, as a reminder as well, this is being recorded tonight, this presentation. So we'll be putting that on, our city's social media platforms, and I suspect YouTube channel. It's going out on KCOM to enhance that engagement and that community ability for community input. If folks have questions, beyond tonight, if something pops up in your brain that you didn't think to ask, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to myself, to the city administrator. And if we can't answer the questions, Professor Tilyer and Professor Smith, have articulated that, hey, they're there for us, so, we can get questions answered and throughout the process. So in short, that's, for this piece, that's where we're going to be going. And again, when the final report's done, again, we'll be making it public. I'd imagine that, we'll digitize it in some way, shape, or form and put that again on our website, available for public consumption as well.
And I guess I would just add to that on the, after these reports are delivered and presented, and they will be in public meetings. This is not at all, from my perspective and from Chief Bowers' perspective, we're checking this box to say we did this research. That's not at all. We really are wanting to understand the data, understand the information, so that we can make informed decisions about our resources. We want to know if our current staffing model in the police department, how well that lines up with the kind of calls we get, and the kind of interactions and contacts we have. And so I would imagine that we may not be perfectly aligned, our resources with our needs, and so I would expect there to be robust community conversation and council discussion and staff discussion about what does this information tell us. And I think that's where some of the most interesting conversation will happen, is after this report comes out. Then what do we do with that information? What kind of creative solutions? I've heard a lot of creative ideas from our community over the last year and a half about resources and how can we respond to this kind of call and that kind of call. And without this information, we can't make changes or can't reallocate resources, not wisely anyway. So I think what we'll see is, to Chief Bowers' point, this is I think you said starting point, not the end point. Is that I think after we get this information is when we really get to have really engaging community conversation about, okay, now we understand more. Now what do we do? How do we look at our limited resources and perhaps utilize them better to better serve our community?
And those are all the questions we have in queue. We do have just a thank you from one of the participants, just for everyone's thoughtfulness and the time and the explanation. So with that, I would like to thank Professors Tilyer and Smith, Chief Bowers, City Administrator Sara Lillevand, and say to everyone, thanks for joining us and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.